The Holocaust was an attack against humanity, notably in regards to the extermination of Jewish people. But they were not the sole target of Nazi hatred. One of the least mentioned, if not forgotten, victims of the Holocaust were the homosexual population, made up of mainly gay men. During the Holocaust, this targeted population was given some of the worst treatment possible in camps and on experimentation tables. But prior to Hitler's regime, this was not always the case. The original German Penal Code of 1871 included paragraph 175, a law that criminalized any sexual acts between men of age gaps, and men and animals. The punishment for such acts was imprisonment for several months. However, this law was hardly enforced.
Therefore, from the 1920s to the 1930s, the gathering of men and women at gay bars and cafes, like El Dorado in Berlin, wasn't uncommon. Many gay men and lesbians freely expressed their sexuality in cities like Berlin, Hamburg, and Munich. Even so, efforts to repeal paragraph 175 were made, small as they were. German physician and sexologist Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld was a major figure in the fight for the rights of sexual minorities. He founded the Scientific Humanitarian Committee, the first organization for homosexuals, where he advocated for the abolition of paragraph 175, for public education about homosexuality, and that homosexuals claimed their rights. Dr. Hirschfeld also later founded the Institute of Sexual Research in 1919, a large archive on sexuality, which provided educational and clinical consultation services. He was a huge supporter of gay rights and was dedicated to teaching and informing others on sexuality. However, these ideas did not last long, because soon after, Hitler becomes Chancellor of Germany. The Nazis begin to spread propaganda, and Hitler bans all homosexual and lesbian organizations. The Institute of Sexual Research was burned down by the Nazi youth. Consequently, the majority of the archives were burned, and much of the research and information was lost. Dr. Hirschfeld himself was out of the country when the burning took place, and died in France.
Homophobia increased, but despite this, there was considerable conspiracy regarding homosexuality within the Nazi Party. Some leaders like Heinrich Himmler were adamant about the dangers of homosexuality and how a nation with declining birth rates would perish. Ernst Röhm, an early political ally to Hitler, who was commander of the Nazi Party's militia and head of the stormtroopers or brown shirts, was actually gay and made no effort to conceal this from his friend, who did not have an opinion about him at the time. Then on June 30 to July 2nd of 1934, the night of the Long Knives, Hitler orders the execution of Röhm and the stormtroopers for what they claimed to be a coup, although no evidence of such a plot was ever presented. While news coverages and official statements justified the purge as a threat to Hitler's authority, some suggest that the idea of homosexuality in the Nazi Party was too demoralizing and needed to be eliminated, or that it just couldn't be tolerated at that point. Whether Röhm was killed for his betrayal or his sexuality is never truly known. In 1935, the Nazi Party revised the original paragraph 175, expanding the list of offenses to be any display or acts of lewd intimacy between men, no matter how large or minor they are. The punishment of imprisonment added several more years to the convicted. Those who were convicted of homosexuality were sent to concentration camps like Buchenwald, where they were given the hardest type of labor. All victims had clothing just like other targeted populations, but they were also given an extra label of a black dot and the number 175 on their back. Later, they were identified with the pink triangle.
Notice that the homosexual victims were mainly male. Lesbians were also considered in the targeted population, but not to the extent and frequency of gay men. Women were deemed important for the purpose of producing children, having a role in the kitchen, and their faith in the church. The way the Nazis viewed homosexuality was that of a disease that could wipe out the Aryan race, because the men would not be having sex with other women. As far as the Nazis were concerned, the preservation and proliferation of the Aryan race would be threatened by declining birth rate if other German citizens were infected by homosexuality. Homosexual victims were forced into the most gruesome labor, but beyond that was inhumane experimentation and practices. The Nazis wanted to find out if homosexuality could be inherited. They believed that homosexuality was a feminine part of the men that did not belong, and thus injected them with male hormones. Castration, sexual abuse, and prostitution were forced upon the victims in exchange for lies of freedom. Beatings, whippings, and physical violence were inflicted until victims severely bled from their skin being torn open. Prisoners seen together were given 15 to 20 lashes.
The result was the death of approximately 6,000 men who died of labor and torture, perhaps more. Very few were sent to death camps. Soon, with the end of World War II and the liberation of all camps, survivors were given a voice, but homosexual victims were left out of reparations and refused a chance to speak. Despite the memorial to persecuted homosexual victims built in Berlin as other memorials were, much of the world is very unaware that they were a part of the Holocaust. Common major information sites hardly mention homosexuals among other targeted populations. Even Europe and the United States did not research their persecution due to the stigmatization of homosexuality. Many survivors were also afraid to come out, so they remained silent. Today, more voices of homosexual victims in the Holocaust are being heard today so that they may regain the rights they had lost.